When I was 12, I attended summer camp to learn how to ride horses. We were going to be away from our parents for 4 or 5 nights. I was really excited because I always wanted to learn how to ride a horse due to my love for animals, but I was also nervous about being away from my family and around strangers for that long. Most of it was amazing and everything I dreamed of. However, the one night labeled Sleep Under the Stars is an experience that I don't think I'll ever forget. That night we had to leave our bunks and go outside to sleep in tents. I hated tents, but everyone else was doing it, so I figured I'd play along. There were a lot of activities that took place before bed. We were able to sit by the campfire, make s'mores, and tell stories. When it came time for bed, it was 4 of us to a tent, and I could already tell I wasn't going to get much sleep. I just couldn't get comfortable and was wishing it was morning. The other people in my tent seemed to pass out almost immediately, which left me to sit there and try to count sheep in the dark. There were a lot of tents in a small area due to the fact that everyone in the camp was sleeping outside for one night. I was starting to get a little drowsy when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside of the tent. I was right near the mesh window of the tent because I tended to get hot and was hoping the cool breeze would let me sleep. The footsteps then got louder, but I tried to ignore them, presuming it was a counselor or one of the camp leaders. But then I felt a presence right outside my tent. It was like someone was kneeling right outside the mesh window. I gathered the courage to look outside the window, and there was something outside. I didn't look long enough to see what it was, but something was there. It was silent at first, but then I heard whispering. Just mumbling and whispering for minutes and minutes without a break. I couldn't really make out the words because it was so soft, but I could definitely hear something. I thought I could hear the words Savior, Sacrifice, Wept. I feel like I've heard the words wept a lot, but like I said, I couldn't really make it out. Every so often it would stop and I would peek my head out of my sleeping bag to check and see if someone was there. And the figure was always still there right outside the mesh window. On and off I could hear the whispering and mumbling all night. I tried several times to kick or punch someone in my tent to wake them up, but it didn't work. Eventually, during one of the moments of silence, I must have dozed off. As scared as I was, I have no clue how I was able to fall asleep even ever so briefly. I checked the window again and nothing was there, but about 5 minutes later, I heard a loud shriek and a gust of wind. When I woke up the next morning, I asked everyone if they heard or experienced anything similar to what I did during the night. No one heard or saw anything other than me. I know I wasn't asleep and that I absolutely saw and heard those things that night. I don't want to say it wasn't human because nothing gave me that idea. But what type of person would have knelt by our tent and mumbled under their breath the entire night? As scared as I was at the time, I'm glad I never had another experience like that again. If you're like me, staying home alone every day in the summer can become a drag. I've always been someone who needs to stay busy all the time. I don't like being alone and like to always be active. Last year, after finishing my freshman year of college, I decided to take a summer job to make some extra cash. I worked for a landscaping company, but the pay was under the table. I won't put the name of the company out there, but the owner seemed eager to get me on immediately, so I figured perhaps I could become a full-time employee later in the summer. For the time being, he agreed to pay me based on different jobs we did. For the first few weeks it was great. I was getting super tan and jacked from all the lifting. The first 3 weeks he paid me and I was getting paid quite well. But by the time we got to the 4th week is when things started to get weird. He usually paid me on Friday, but didn't pay me this week. When I brought it up to him, he just smiled and said that he was going to start paying me every 2 weeks. I was kind of annoyed, but basically said whatever because I figured I would have a fat paycheck in another week. Well, fast forward another week and I don't get paid. Now I'm upset. I've been doing hard work for 2 weeks and not getting paid. I called my boss and asked what the deal was. He claimed he just forgot and was sorry. I shrugged it off and said, whatever, it was fine. We agreed to meet on Saturday for the payment. I went to the spot he told me to meet him at, and he handed me an envelope. I took it and told him I'd see him on Monday. When I opened the envelope, it was just pay for 1 week. I called him furious, but he insisted that he paid me for the previous week. I flipped out over it and told him I didn't want to continue working, especially under the table, and that it was making me uncomfortable. He called and begged me to come back for a huge job we had next week and that he would pay me double. I agreed, thinking this would likely be my last job and I could take the cash and move on. Monday comes and I meet him at this huge house surrounded by nothing but open land. We started laying mulch and setting up the front yard. Before I knew it, I was alone. I didn't see him anywhere. I got a little angry that I was now by myself doing all this work. After an hour or so, I finally see him emerge from the back of the house. He looked frustrated and almost a little nervous. He came up to me and in a very soft voice he said, "Can you go see if you can get the water turned on in the basement? I tried and I couldn't get it. Please?" It was a weird request. I honestly wanted to get out of the heat for a second, so I accepted. Once in the basement, I found the water hooked up in a matter of seconds, but what I noticed right away was that the water was already on. I turned around quickly, and that's when I saw my boss and a skinny woman standing behind me. He had his hands out facing me, and she had one hand behind her back, almost as if though she was concealing something. Before I could speak, he said, "You shouldn't have come down here. And just so you know, I'm sorry." Thinking quick on my feet, I kicked him in his ankle and ran right through the skinny woman. I got to my car and drove away and called the police. The worst part about all of this was that there was literally nothing they could do because I was technically working under the table, and there was no records of this man's company, even though I had seen one of his trucks with the logo on it. Fortunately for me, this guy didn't know where I lived. It almost seemed like the company was a scam from the start, but I'm not sure what his intentions with me ever were. I know there is a lot I could have done differently, but this is easily the weirdest experience of my entire life. Was this psycho really going to try to hurt me over a week or so of pay? Either way, I'm glad I never ran into that landscaping psychopath again. Two years ago, my wife and I purchased a small property on the lake for the family to spend the summer months away from the hustle and bustle of the city. As soon as kindergarten concluded for the year, my wife and I packed up our belongings and our 5-year-old son to set off for our new summer vacation home. My wife is a biologist, and she would be able to work from home due to our location and research she could do from our property. Our family is fortunate that she has such a successful job which allows us the freedom to live comfortably. Unfortunately for me, we have moved a lot over the last 10 to 15 years and have not been able to stay with the same company for an extended period of time. This new town had one small grocery store that seemed to be the main location that everyone used for shopping. It also seemed to be a hotspot for tourists who would visit once the weather turned warm. Luckily for me, I am a trained butcher from jobs I had in my early 20s, so finding work was usually not very difficult. I applied for a job at this small store and got a job almost immediately. There would be 2 butchers on staff, myself and the guy who ran the store, Will, the same person who hired me. For the first few weeks, he seemed like a pretty quiet and laid-back guy. I would get to work every day shortly after 7 a.m., He never really cared that I was usually 5 minutes late. He was about 6 foot tall, greasy black hair, and a huge nose. He had really small, green, beady eyes. His voice was really low and rumbled a bit when he talked, and he had baby-looking teeth, like when he smiled you could see a whole mess of teeth. After the first few weeks is when I noticed things starting to get a little odd. His temper would get out of hand and he would explode on me seemingly out of nowhere, and then 5 minutes later be totally cool again. It didn't really bother me too much because he was technically my boss, and I just assumed maybe he had some kind of anger issues, and I'm not one to judge. After these first few weeks of little outbursts, they began to get more uncomfortable. He would start saying things like, "You better get this done before I leave or you'll be sorry." Or mumble things like, "Sometimes I think you'd be more help if you were dead." This stuff made me uncomfortable, but again, I just assumed that maybe that's how he managed. I met a lot of old school butchers during my time in this business, and some of them are really intense individuals, so I figured this was more of one and the same. Fast forward to a day when I showed up to work 15 minutes late. I got caught in a traffic jam, and unfortunately there isn't really any alternative routes to get to the store. I showed up and Will was just standing in the meat cooler staring at me. He had a black apron on, covered in blood from cutting all morning, with the huge butcher knife still in his hand. I tried to apologize, and before I could speak, he put his hand up to silence me and said in his deep voice, "This will be the last time you're late. The last person to disrespect me." And he kind of paused for a moment and looked down to the ground and then finished by saying, "Never mind. Just don't be late again." The next few days he was very quiet, like something was bothering him. But to me, it was great not having to hear him complain about everything. He left early one day and told me to just make sure I cut a few extra things and to clean the meat. It was about 7 p.m. and I was about to call it a night and head home until I noticed something. In the back corner of the meat cooler, we had what was called bone cans. This is a waste can where you dispose of bones and trim fat. Coming out of the bottom of one of the cans was a small pool of blood. Now, ordinarily, this wouldn't be a huge deal because I see this a lot with my job, but this pool looked fresh, and the smell was real bad. I tried to move the can, and it was much heavier than it usually was. They get picked up once a week, but this week they were a day late for some reason. I took the lid off and almost passed out due to the smell. I also noticed meat in there that was a strange color and again a lot more blood than usual. I put the lid back and left that night trying to figure out what the heck was in that can and why it smelled so bad. I've been in this business for a long time and I've smelled bad meat before, but this was so bad. The next day I came in and Will was standing in the corner again and looked incredibly angry. He came at me with a crazed look in his eye and a knife in hand and said, "What do you think you saw in that can?" He started to poke my chest with his finger and say in a really hostile and defensive voice, "Come on, pal. Tell me what you saw. I know you were digging. Just tell me what you think you saw." His voice started to turn into a yell, and this is where I decided to call it quits. Once you put your hands on me, I am done. The crazy thing is, I don't even know how he knew I looked in the bone can. Maybe I left the lid ajar. I couldn't remember. I left and he actually followed me to my car. Not to apologize, but to keep on hammering me about the bone can. I drove off and looked in the mirror and he was standing in the parking lot still yelling to himself. Now the reality is I didn't actually dig or even look in the can longer than a few seconds. I drove home immediately and my wife of course supported me and was happy to let me just spend the rest of my summer breaks with my son being a stay-at-home dad. About a week after the incident where I quit, I was awoken in my recliner in my living room close to 4 to 5 a.m. I was woken up by lights outside that had driven by the property. The wife was already gone for the day and my son was sleeping. All the lights in the house were off and I made my way to the window. There was a massive red pickup truck parked outside my house. Now the scary part is there was nobody inside the truck, and even though I couldn't make out a lot of the details, the truck looked like the one always parked outside of the grocery store. Will's truck. I went into my son's room and stayed there awake for the rest of the night. At about 7:30 a.m. I looked outside and the truck was gone. For the next few nights I saw that truck driving around the block but couldn't see the driver. I told my wife what I had been seeing, and she recommended perhaps we go back to the house in the city as her current project was almost done anyway. A few weeks after being back in the city, I needed to head back out to the lake to grab some of the items that we had forgotten. When I got there, one of our windows was broken and things were tossed around like someone had been inside the property. I did report this to the local authorities, mostly to document the damage that had been done to the property. I know I don't have any proof that Will caused the damage, or that my family was actually in danger. I just know something was off about that guy, and I think next year we are planning to sell that property and find some much further away from that area. The events of this story happened a couple of years ago to my friends and I after our last day of high school in our senior year. We decided to celebrate by hiking and camping in this massive forest close to our hometown. We talked about it for years, and this was going to be our celebration for graduating. Our friend group was pretty outdoorsy, but so were most of the people who grew up here. Anyways, we had always heard that there was a beautiful crystal clear lake in the middle of the forest. The lake was supposedly accompanied by breathtaking waterfalls. One of our friends, Chris, got hiking directions to the lake, and we decided to make this post-graduation trip a reality. Chris had the most outdoor experience out of all of us, so we trusted him to make the plans. It was Chris and his girlfriend Mindy, myself, and my friend Danny, and our other friend Tony with his girlfriend Marissa. The trip was planned as a 3-day hiking trip while camping each night under the stars. It sounded amazing. We would reach the lake on the second day and then head back. We would have to camp one more night and be back on the third day pretty early in the morning. The trip started out amazing. I have never really been the biggest fan of sleeping in a tent, but the views were truly breathtaking. The sounds and the way the sun shined through the trees made it seem like we were exploring another world. Once it started to get dark, we decided to set up camp for the night. It was pretty comical watching us trying to set up tents while exhausted, but we managed to figure it out. We stayed up for a while, telling stories and playing pitch, but called it a night relatively early so we could start back up hiking at sunrise. Danny and I woke up in our tent shortly after 3 a.m. We swore we could hear voices outside of the tent. It sounded like air, but didn't have the howling of the wind. He told me of course it was wind and there was nothing to worry about. But to me, it almost sounded like whispers. I could hear sticks cracking in the distance. You'd expect to hear quiet or even crickets or something, but instead it was all sorts of other racket. I had a horrible feeling that maybe there was a bear or something out there, or maybe even other people. And then fear came over me, feeling like we weren't alone. Danny eventually fell back asleep, but I was wired for the rest of the night. I sat clenching my pillow and jumped out at every little noise. A little after 6, I heard Chris outside of his tent, and I went out to greet him. He also heard the weird noises and admitted that in all the years camping, he never heard noises like that, but wasn't really alarmed. We packed up our gear and headed out to the lake. If we kept good pace, we would make it by noonish. We all seemed sluggish and tired from the night. We were more tired and short with each other today than the previous day. I had an uneasy feeling the entire day, thinking somebody was out there following us. About 12:30 we arrived at the lake, and honestly, it was so worth it. The waterfalls looked like glass the way the sun reflected off of it, and the water actually looked like it was glowing. It was beautiful. We swam for a while and played by the waterfall. The events of the previous evening seemed to vanish in my mind for a while. We got dry and decided to start heading back so our third day of hiking tomorrow wouldn't be so bad. We set up camp about 5 hours or so from our cars. If it was up to me, I would have just kept walking. But anybody who has been in the woods at nightfall knows it is pitch black. It wasn't worth getting lost, so we decided to just camp and get home tomorrow. We were all beat and passed out almost right away after setting up camp. Again, I was jolted awake a little after 3 a.m. This time, there was no mistaking it. There was clearly voices outside the tent. We could hear women's voices, several of them, and they were laughing. Not only laughing like a giggle, a deep screeching laugh. We could hear the branches on the ground breaking around us. It seemed like we were surrounded. Danny was awake with me, and he was scared stiff. We could only make out several words amongst the mumbles. We could hear the creepy voices saying things in their low, drawn-out voices. Flesh and strike. I want to strike. Those horrifying phrases were followed by more cackling and mumbles that we couldn't make out. We all sat in fear all night listening to these noises on and off. It would stop for a time and then start back up, almost sounding like it was directly outside the tent. At sunrise, we heard Chris yell outside his tent. We all came out to find a crazy amount of footprints surrounding our campsite, and they went in all sorts of directions with seemingly no rhyme or reason. There were strange patterns of rocks and sticks set up all over the campsite. The sticks looked bent and almost human-like silhouettes. We packed up our gear in record time and nearly ran the rest of the way out of the forest. Unlike the previous 2 days, we heard laughing and twigs snapping in the distance the entire trek back to the cars. Myself and Mindy started to cry just because of the sheer panic and fear we felt while trying to race out of the woods, and probably because we were extremely overtired. When we would look in the distance behind us, or side to side, we would see nothing, but we still heard the sounds. We finally made the near 5-hour hike in just under 4 hours. It was an amazing sigh of relief to be able to see the cars. As we all ran to our cars to load the gear up, I sat in the passenger seat and waited for Danny. None of us have ever returned to that forest. I'm not really sure what happened to us over the course of those few summer nights. Some say witchcraft, and others say just some woman or kids who were messing with us. Others think it was our imagination, but we all witnessed the same thing. I know what I heard that evening. Maybe it doesn't seem that scary, but for me, it was the most terrifying couple of nights of my life. What a way to start off graduation and my summer vacation. I am currently in my late 20s, but at the time of these events, my 8th grade school year had just ended. I was excited that I was going to be able to spend the entire summer with my 2 closest buddies, and that we would be heading into 9th grade together. We didn't really do much other than just hang out, play PlayStation 2, play some basketball outside, and message girls from our class on Instant Messenger, which I hope most of you remember what that was. If not, then I guess I'm getting way too old. We would usually hang out at my house because my parents were always pretty cool with my friends being there, and the way my house was set up, we pretty much had a ton of privacy, which was awesome for teenage boys being idiots. My house at the time was located on a pretty quiet street, but my neighborhood was in close proximity to the more rough sections of my hometown. A close walk from my house was a corner store that sold really cheap soda, chips, and candy. This was obviously a frequent destination for me and my friends. Well, about a week after 8th grade ended, my 2 buddies were staying overnight like they always did. We thought it would be a cool idea to sneak out of the house after my parents went to sleep and walk to the corner store a few blocks away. Of course, not to do anything crazy, but just to have the thrill of being out late on our own. And being a foolish teenager, I had no awareness of the danger I was potentially putting myself and friends in. Around 11, my parents went to sleep, and that's when we decided to sneak out of the house. At first, the thrill of being out was awesome, but the feeling would soon change when we got to the store. We went in there with about $20, and we planned on spending it on a whole bunch of snacks. We all split up to grab certain things. I was in the back corner looking at the soda when I saw somebody lurking in the opposite corner. The only reason why this was concerning to me was because he was facing me and not facing the shelves of products. I pretended I didn't notice him because, who knows, maybe it was just a coincidence. As I looked at the Faygo sodas, I noticed in the reflection of the cooler that a shadowy figure was now moving closer and still facing me. I quickly grabbed a 2-liter and went and found my friends. I darted away, and when I looked back, the figure was standing right where I was just a moment ago, and still facing me and not the case. I was freaked out, but didn't want to let my friends know that I was. I also want to add that there was nobody else in the store other than us, the cashier, and this guy or girl. We grabbed our stuff and cashed out. I was trying to be quick about it, but my friends were being stupid and loud, perhaps trying to show off, but honestly, I was just freaking out. We started the several block walk home. I was moving pretty good, and finally my friends stopped and asked what my problem was. I told them what had happened in the store, and they seemed pretty rattled as well. We continued moving quickly. My house was maybe only 100 feet away at this point when we noticed that the person from the store was now rushing full speed up the hill at us. We ran as fast as we could. Lucky for us, the lunatic was still quite a ways away yet. We ran into the front door and for some reason still tried to be as quiet as we could as not to wake my parents. We turned and locked the door, made sure all the lights were off. The person reached my house and started to bang on the front door angrily. That's when I finally gave in to logic and woke my parents, who immediately called the authorities. I tried yelling through the door that we called the cops, and the person didn't seem to respond. He just kept trying to open the door and continued banging on it. After a minute or two, he took a decorative stone from our front yard and broke the window next to the front door. That is when I finally got a good look at the guy. He tried to climb into the window, and the broken glass knocked his hood off. He was completely expressionless. He had dirty blonde hair, was clean-shaved, and honestly looked like an average Joe. He was about halfway through the window when my dad came out with a bat and started swinging at him. Before there was too much of a struggle, we saw the lights and heard sirens. The cops got out of the car screaming and pulled the man out of the window. It was the most intense thing I've ever seen in front of my eyes. The man was obviously arrested. Apparently he had no criminal history and no history of drugs or alcohol. When questioned by the cops, he said, "Honestly, I was bored, and I just felt like being a little bit evil tonight." We had no idea what his intentions were, but just felt incredibly lucky that we somehow came out of that event physically unharmed. Mentally, I still think about that night over a decade later. I used to stay up for hours thinking if we weren't that far ahead of him, he could have caught up to us and possibly hurt us. I also used to stay up for hours in fear that he would show up at my house again when I'd least expect it. It just goes to show you that even the most harmless decisions can sometimes lead to consequences you regret the most. Summer break is an awesome time to kick back, relax, and even enjoy some traveling. Unfortunately for me, my summer break did not consist of vacationing or kicking back. My old roommate Dave was going on vacation with his fiancée, and he asked me to take care of his golden retriever Millard. Always trying to make a quick buck, I quickly accepted. I planned on staying overnight with Millard while Dave was gone for a couple of nights. Feeling lonely, I asked some of my friends to come over and hang out for a while. We sat outside, ate some wings, and just hung out for a couple of hours. I had to work at 6:30 in the morning, so I kicked them out at around 11 and decided to get ready for bed. I put on the TV and made myself comfortable on the living room couch. I started to doze off instantly, and while I was going in and out, I heard the doorbell ring. I kind of jolted awake and just sat still for a moment. I thought perhaps maybe it was the TV, and maybe I just woke myself up thinking it was the doorbell. That was quickly proven false when the doorbell rang again. My heart was practically jumping out of my chest. I grabbed my watch and saw that it was around 11:47 p.m. Who the heck would be at the door at this hour of the night? I slowly approached the door as the bell rang again for the third time. It was a shady-looking guy with a backwards cap on. He had a big brown bag in his hand. I opened the front door a crack while still keeping the chain on and didn't open the screen door, and I asked what he wanted. In a very soft and unconvincing voice, he said, "Hi, I have your food delivery." I immediately yelled that I didn't order any food. He proceeded to say my address and then followed with, "That is your address, right? I have your delivery." More annoyed than anything else, I told him once more that he had the wrong house and slammed the door in his face and turned all the lights off. The house I was staying in was a split-level ranch, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's kind of like having a 1.5-story house. The basement is usually a living room, and it's not completely under the ground. The windows are usually like eye level, so I went to the basement part of the house and was looking out the front windows. He was sitting in his car with the car not on, still parked in the driveway. I was a little spooked, so I called my brother to tell him what happened. He told me not to worry, and it was probably some kind of mistake. I agreed and went back to look out the window, and the car was still there in the driveway, but he wasn't inside of it anymore. I grabbed the dog and locked myself in Dave's bedroom. She barked and growled all night long, not sure if it was because she could hear things or because she was stuck in the room. I hardly slept that night, and when it was time for me to leave for work, I got ready in the bedroom and ran out of the house as fast as I could. I had a brief moment of relief when I noticed the car wasn't in the driveway, but that soon changed when I turned the corner and the car was parked on the side of the road. I went to work terrified. I blasted my family that day asking if it was some kind of practical joke, and they assured me and promised me that it wasn't them. I came back to feed Millard after work with my one friend, and we noticed footprints all around the house and scratches on the siding of the house where one of the back windows were. It looked like someone had tried to scare me or actually tried to break in and were unsuccessful. In hindsight, I realized I should have gotten the license plate number, but I just thought I was maybe being paranoid. I could have also asked what company they represented so I could call to see if it was real or not. When Dave returned, I brought this up to him, and he said that he had never had an experience like this. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe the delivery person was angry they got pranked and were now stuck with the bill. Or maybe I could have been in real-life danger. Either way, this one summer night I still bring up to my friends when they want to hear a freaky story. This is a short story that happened to me several years ago, but still affects me to this day. Now, objectively speaking, this may not be very scary for others reading this, but the image is burned into my mind. It is something I don't think I will ever forget. School had just ended 3 weeks prior, and my friend and I were just hanging out enjoying a surprisingly beautiful summer night. I live in a very quiet town. There really isn't much commotion or really much of anything that goes on. We have one main school, and our graduating class is tiny compared to most. Around midnight, we were pretty sick of playing games and wanted to do something different. He suggested walking around outside on the beautiful clear summer night. Without much hesitation, I agreed. It was after midnight in a quiet town. I figured not much could go wrong. My parents were asleep, but they trusted me anyway, so sneaking out just to walk probably wouldn't have been a huge issue. We ended up staying out for a couple of hours. We talked about movies, wrestling, and what our plans for the rest of the summer would be. Up to this point, it had actually been one of my favorite nights in a long time, just to be able to enjoy the nice breeze, moonlight, and have some good old-fashioned conversation. We were already on our way back home and were probably only about 5 minutes from my house. We were walking down a very low-lit street. On the right side were some old houses where 95% of the lights were off, and our left was just trees. My friend pointed out as we were walking that the way one of the lights were hitting the trees, it almost looked like a person. We laughed at first and kind of were amazed at how much it really did look like a person. But after a moment the laughter faded away as we realized that maybe this wasn't just shadow. So, like the fools that we were, we decided to explore, and I pulled back a few branches and saw that there actually was a woman standing there. She had a huge, almost disturbing smile on her face. She was old, probably in her 70s, I would guess. She was dressed normal and had lots of nice jewelry on. She looked how my grandma would dress for holiday parties, but the scariest part was that she was just standing there like a statue, smiling at us. For a moment we stood there in shock, and within a split second her smile vanished and she jumped out and made a huge grunt and a scream. We ran as fast as we could back to the house. To my knowledge, she didn't follow us or anything. I know most people might not find this particularly scary, but in the middle of the night when you find a creepy old lady hiding in the trees, it really rattles your cage. Nothing else of note came from this incident, but as I mentioned previously, I'll never be able to get the image of her smiling and suddenly screaming at us out of my head. I will try to tell this story to the best of my ability, but as my friends could tell you, I have a terrible memory, so some of the details may be excluded. This happened to me when I was 14 years old. I am now 27. It was summer break. I can remember this because I was extremely bored, and I felt like I could literally die from the boredom. My parents went to work every morning, and I was left home alone to do chores. I was a trustworthy kid, so my parents allowed me to stay home alone. The two rules were never to leave the house, and I couldn't use the oven. I lived in a really nice area other than the one extremely old and ugly house on the corner. The house was covered with vines and all sorts of unkempt landscaping everywhere. Well, one summer day, my stupid 14-year-old self thought that it was going to be a good idea to go out and check the house. It was during the day, so I figured nothing could go wrong. I wanted to see inside. I wasn't going to steal anything, I just wanted to see what the inside looked like. Every day when we used to get off the bus, we would always tell stories of it being haunted and stuff like that. Well, when I finally saw my friends again, I wanted to tell them that I had been inside the house. I got all black clothes on and thought I was going to be super sneaky. It was 12 in the afternoon, so I probably looked like a moron. I approached the front of the house and was surprised that the door was actually locked. I banged on the door for a second and was able to jimmy the lock. I opened the door, and my excitement quickly vanished when I was greeted with an elderly man holding a knife towards my face. He looked so old and gross that I almost thought he wasn't real. He had a long white beard and Albert Einstein-looking hair. He was wearing a thick red flannel despite being the summer. As soon as I had a split second to process this man holding a knife near my face, I turned and ran as fast as I could, and heard him yell, "That's it, you're done!" I, of course, had no idea what that meant. My 14-year-old heart was beating out of my chest. I was in amazement that somebody actually lived there, and I started to panic that I was going to get arrested for breaking in. My parents were going to kill me. I was going to be in so much trouble. Well, sure enough, several minutes later, the police showed up at my house, and my parents were called right away. The cop was really nice, and I tried to explain to them that I thought it was an abandoned house. What got me in trouble was that this old man said that I had been terrorizing him for weeks, and the truth was, that was the first time I had ever been there. According to the old man, he said he can hear my footprints downstairs in his kitchen when he was trying to sleep. Luckily, I was 14, and had my parents to defend me and say that that obviously wasn't true. Fast forward about a week and I was grounded for just about my entire lifetime, but most of the dust had cleared. Until my doorbell rang and it was the cops again. I explained that I had been home the entire day, and luckily for me, my dad was off that day and he was there to back up my story. Well, upon investigation into the matter, the police had found somebody living in this old man's crawl space for weeks. At night, he would apparently sneak around for food and use the bathroom. The day that I broke in was very suspicious because he heard a lot of noise the previous night, and when he saw me, he just assumed that I was the intruder. The man actually came down to my dad and thanked me for breaking in because it actually helped him figure out what was really going on. So yeah, I had my great story to tell my friends. Sad thing was, I was grounded for the remainder of the summer, so I was going to have to wait for school to tell them. I remember being a teenager and really enjoying those first few weeks of summer break. Sleeping in, staying up late, hanging with friends, and basically just enjoying being out of school and not having to worry about homework or teachers. On this specific night, my parents were out of town for their anniversary. My friend James was coming over for the night, and my brother, who was 20 at the time, was going to be there to look after us because it was only one night. Well, around 1 a.m., James just happened to look out the window, and there were two people standing in the middle of the road, and they appeared to be looking at us. We told my brother, who then decided to look outside. They were now taking pictures, and it looked like the pictures were aimed at our house. So my brother, who doesn't really mess around, went outside and yelled at the two from our front steps. It was a man and a woman, probably in their 20s, I would guess. The man didn't say anything, but the woman said, "Oh, we're sorry, we were just trying to take a picture of the moon. It's really beautiful." My brother said that he didn't care and they needed to leave right now. She then insisted that he come down there and look at the moonlight, and then he would understand. After a brief verbal scuffle, my brother then said, "If you guys don't get off my property, I'm going to make you." And he started to approach the couple. Once my brother got to the street, the man who was in the road hit him in the back of the head. James and I just sat in disbelief. We didn't know what to do. Clearly, we were only young teenagers, and this guy is attempting to beat up my brother. James called the police and explained what was happening. I was in a panic, worrying if my brother was okay. I looked again, and the man was now kicking him, and the woman just sat there and laughed, seemingly enjoying it. I covered my eyes, and that's when I heard her yell, "Run." My neighbor from across the street ran out with a baseball bat. He didn't hit the man, but he tried. They ran off quickly and were out of sight in a moment. The man helped my brother up and helped him to the door. The cop showed up a few minutes later and we gave our statement. Of course, there was really nothing that could be done because none of us got a good look at the couple. Writing this as an adult, I still get a sick feeling in my stomach every time I see the moon on a summer night. So the events of this story happened to me several years ago during the last family vacation I ever took during summer break. Every year we used to drive a couple of hours away from my hometown to a beautiful tourist area near the ocean with lots of great seafood. This year was no different, but we decided to leave in the middle of the night when my dad got out of work so we could be there by 7 a.m. and have the entire day at the ocean. The first part of this trip was great. I slept for a little bit, as did my sister and mom. I live on the northeastern coast of the United States, and for a huge stretch of that trip, it's just trees and mountains. Of what I could see was actually very relaxing and soothing to try and sleep too. A little after 3 a.m., I was woken up by my dad, who kind of loudly shouted some curse words. I asked him if everything was okay, and he said in an almost nervous voice, "Yeah, honey, go back to sleep." Without asking any other questions, I closed my eyes, and almost immediately after, my eyes were open again because my dad swerved the car so erratically I thought my sister was going to go through the window. This is when things started to turn for the worst. My mom woke up and yelled at my dad, and that's when we found out what was happening. My dad had told us that there had been a Jeep of some kind behind us for about an hour. They were riding our tail, and every time my dad switched lanes, they would as well. This was the time before cell phones were hugely popular, so we couldn't just call the police. We decided to stop at the next rest area and call the authorities. We saw a sign that said rest area 2 miles. It seemed like forever away now that we knew that whoever this was really messing with us. And if they had truly been following us for an hour, then this was more than a joke, and definitely somebody who intended to harm us. 2 miles came and we pulled into the 24-hour rest area. We pulled right into the front area and the Jeep followed us. I have never been so scared in my entire life. My mom, sister, and I got out of the car to go inside and call the police, while my dad tried to defend himself. I'll never forget what I saw. It was a navy blue Jeep and had 5 people inside the Jeep. They all had white masks on that had different smiling artwork on them. All 5 people got out of the car and just stood there, waving at my dad. One of the figures looked like it was holding something, but I honestly couldn't be sure. I still can't believe the luck of what happened next. A patrol car just happened to pull in, and the masked people got back in the Jeep and drove off. We flagged down the cop and explained what had happened and gave our statement. We ended up staying at the rest stop until dawn and continued with the rest of our trip. I wish I could explain the horror to you of seeing a car full of people with those masks on. Why would they follow us for an entire hour just to scare us? And what would have happened if the patrol car didn't luckily show up? So I might have a different perspective on summer than most of you. I usually hated summer. My parents both worked during the day and left me chores to do every single frickin' day. I hated it. My friends were out doing everything they wanted while I had to do housework and yard work. One particular day I was tasked with painting the spindles on the front porch, which would probably take more than one day to do so. While I was out there painting, I heard the loudest noise coming from the street. It sounded like someone was rolling a tool chest down the road. It was an old guy with a cart that had a bunch of what looked like tools in it. After looking at the cart and putting 2 and 2 together, it was a portable cart to sharpen knives. Having some extra cash and thinking I could do something nice for my parents, I flagged the guy down and ran inside and grabbed the knife block to bring the knives out to be sharpened. I told the guy I was doing it for my parents, and he just looked at me and whispered, "Such a nice boy." He completed the sharpening for me and I gave him the cash and he thanked me and continued down the road, slowly but surely. When my parents got home, I could tell they appreciated the gesture, but I think we're more focused on the painting and how well of a job I did. That night I slept in my living room so I could stay up and watch TV without waking my parents up. I had to pause the TV at one point because I thought I had heard a loud noise. I moved the blinds near the couch and looked outside and saw the cart from earlier before. Okay? I saw the cart, but no person. My dog could tell something was up, so I let her out back, and as I went to turn the back porch light on and let her out back, I could have sworn I saw someone shuffling behind the garage. I freaked out and woke up my dad and told him what I thought I saw. He looked out front and did see the cart, but when he went behind the garage, he didn't see anything. I went to the side door to make sure the door was locked, and the old man was standing directly against the door. I screamed for my dad, and he ran, and came out and confronted the man. I don't remember exactly what he screamed, but he was screaming like I had never heard him scream before, shouting explosives. He called the cops, and the cops eventually showed up, took statements, and took the man away. I think he was charged with trespassing or something along those lines. It's been years since these events have taken place, and the only thing I can still visualize are the spindles on the front porch, and the old man's face pressed against the side door when I went to go lock it. I don't think I'll ever forget that image as much as I'd like to. I hope the story spooked a few of you out there, and if not, maybe it was a good one to fall asleep to. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, always tip your fedoras.